There goes Henri Bergson. He's a great opponent of Cartesian dualism. He rejects the reduction of psychological phenomena to a physical state. And insists that there is no point of contact between the extended and the unextended. And there goes Edmund Husserl, sitting all alone with his transcendental ego. Oh, why did he reject the non-egological prepersonal model of consciousness of the philosophical investigations? To us. That was an abomination.
All right. And that, by the way, is how our guest today, Tamar Gendler, teaches her philosophy classes. She sings to the students, and they are expected to repeat back what she has sung to them. That, in fact, may not be true, but everything else you're going to hear today on the show is true. Our guest is indeed Tamar Gendler, professor of philosophy, psychology, and cognitive science, and the dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Yale University, which means that every spring I am, under her tutelage or something, or oversight or something. I get a lot of emails anyway, and they're often about things that I haven't done. And so, Tamar Gendler, one of the things that I'm going to do now that I've really studied you more intensively, is I'm going to say I would have my updated syllabus available for pre-course shopping, except that there's 2 horses on my chariot, and one of the horses did not want to do this, which is probably an oversimplification, but probably something that your students are tempted to use too. So very excited to have you today. And the reason we're having you today, well, you should explain it. You launched last spring a new course, a new seminar-style course. You're going to expand it to the larger public and explain what its specific motivation is.
Absolutely. And hello, Colin.
Well done. Well done.
Thank you. So the course that I taught last spring was an experimental course. Its title was Public Plato, and it had a subtitle called Ancient Wisdom for the Digital Age. And the idea was to take a bunch of people whose actual writing sounds a little bit like the refrains from the song that you were singing. That is, whose actual writing can sound like esoteric philosophy. And to think about making it contemporaneous in 2 different ways. One in terms of its content and one in terms of its form. What do I mean by each of those? Take, for example, the hypothesis that Plato has that the human soul or the human spirit has a certain kind of complexity. We'll take that as a theory. Modernizing its content means looking at everything from brain science and neuroimaging to work on dual processing. Modernizing its form meant that we as a class looked at everything from YouTube videos to TikToks to tattoos as ways of thinking about how you express content. So your opening song was a perfect example, though not a literal example, of the experimental nature of the course.
Let me ask you one more thing about this, and then I want to really get into specifics here. But so when I teach the course that I teach, because I don't know what I'm doing, but also because I have not known what I was doing for a really long time. So I have some experience. The first thing I say to my students on the first day is, I'm not a professional teacher, really. I've been doing this an awful lot for a really long time, but I don't start with the idea that I have to teach a course. I do something else for a living. So there has to be a reason for the course. There has to be a reason why I'm teaching this course to you. And it must have something to do with the effect that I want to have on you. And then I talk to them a little bit about that. But I'm sure either silently or outspokenly, you do the same thing. Like, what am I going to do with these 8 people that's going to have them walk out of here a little bit different, a little bit differently equipped? Can you quantify that a little bit? What, when it was just 8 people, what did you want to have happen to them?
Beautiful, beautiful. And I should say just for your audience that I taught the seminar as a small seminar for 8 people, but we filmed everything. And I am in the course of turning it into something that will be accessible, I hope, to 1 million people. And one of the things we'll talk about is the difference between those. Yeah. So I really viewed this course as a chance to read and live in 3 old books that have changed my life. And those books are Plato's Republic, Aristotle's Ethics, and Epictetus's Handbook. They're each about 2,000 years old. They come from the ancient Greco-Roman world. They come from a particular philosophical tradition. But I think the reason that they have been so powerful and so enduring is that they express a set of eternal quandaries that human beings confront in a way that makes the world seem somewhat more tractable and manageable. That is, they simultaneously acknowledge how hard it is to be a human being, and even against that backdrop, there are things that we can do that would make our lives worse, and things that we can do that would make our lives better. So I love these books, and they've changed my life. But I also know that there are aspects of them that make them inaccessible, in the same way that I suspect there are many other books in many other world wisdom traditions to which I don't have similar access because I don't have an intuitive connection to them in a way that lets me see what they are getting at. So Plato's Republic has this wonderful metaphor where at the beginning of Plato's Republic, he's trying to figure out what the nature of justice, that is sort of being orderly in your ambitions, what the nature of justice, fairness is within a human being. And he says, when a letter is very small, you can't read it. But if you see a larger letter that has the same shape, when you look back at the original letter, you can recognize the shape that that letter has, right? So that when you know what something is supposed to be like, something hard to understand can become easier to understand. And he uses that conceit to make an analogy between the individual and the city. Let's not worry about that. Let's worry about the lesson that Plato said, which is you can understand something hard if you start by connecting it to something easy. So the goal of this course was to take theme after theme after theme from these old books, connect them to the lives of students and the 9 of us together, connect them to the lives of the 1 million people for whom we were engaging in this seminar in such a way that they could do Plato's trick. They could recognize it in their own life. And then all of a sudden, the complexity of some of these ancient texts becomes more tractable. So my goal was, in a literal sense, to open up these ancient texts to a wider audience, and even more importantly, in a metaphorical sense, to give all of us tools for coming to understand things that we find hard to understand.
And I think we live in this digital environment that's exceptionally confusing, and there are ways in which we just don't know. We don't have a roadmap. So I'll give you an example, and we're on a little bit of a tight clock here. We might have to break this up into 2 different pieces. But I'll give you an example from my own life, but it could easily be from your students' lives, which is that the digital experience opens us up to a lot of contact with people who want to say negative things to us that are going to upset us and hurt us. So I write a column for Hearst, Connecticut newspapers, and so just about every Sunday I get a certain number of emails about it. Most of them are from people who really hate me and hate what I wrote and want to taunt me. And some of them are regular writers. They'll write almost every week. And I know that they're going to try to bully me, and they turn my name into Colin, and they call me Little Colin. They do all this kind of Trumpy stuff. And I want to write back to them and put them in their place. I know at some level I shouldn't even read these things. And I can program them to go to junk and stuff like that, but then I'm just going to go look in the junk. And I know I shouldn't read them, and I know I shouldn't write back because it just feeds that cycle. And there is an opacity for me about my own behavior here. Like, I don't quite understand why I'm doing this thing that I know is counterproductive and that will really feed these trolls. So talk a little bit about how I might use some of these techniques from ancient philosophy to straighten myself out. Because I think your students are probably dealing with that with just negative stuff on all social media too.
Absolutely. And you might also think with positive stuff that overinflates. That is, in general, apportioning our responses to the reactions of the world in appropriate ways is really important. So I would say there are two direct connections between what you're describing and what we read about. One is what's going on when you, against your better judgment, go and read the materials that you have put deliberately into a place where you're not supposed to look at them. And I'll speak to that in a minute. But the second, which is how do you allow yourself to read but not be affected by critical remarks from another. I actually want to read to you a sentence that was written. It was written in a different language. It was written in ancient Greek, but I'm going to read it to you in English. That comes from a book that is 2,000 years old, Epictetus's Handbook. And Epictetus says, remember that what is insulting is not the person who abuses you or hits you, but your judgment about them that they are insulting. So when someone irritates you, be aware that what irritates you is your own belief. And he continues, no one can insult you unless you allow them to do so. So imagine that you're reading through these accusations and one of them says something that is factually false. They say you said XYZ, and in fact, what you said was ABC. You're going to feel a little bit of negative affect over what it is that they're saying. You're going to feel a little sad, but you're going to quickly be able to correct and say, they're mistaken. I didn't say XYZ. I said ABC. The false belief is on their part. I am unscathed by their criticism. Epictetus's point is that you are making a really arbitrary distinction between them getting something factually wrong about what you said and them getting something factually wrong about the value of what you said. And just as you can correct for and say that they're just wrong, I didn't say XYZ, I said ABC. You can likewise, through the cultivation of certain kinds of practice, come to recognize that they said something false. The false thing they said was your commentary was misguided or outrageous or whatever critical term they use. That is, no one's evaluation of you can affect you unless you allow it to do so. That's in their head, not in yours. Now, there's all sorts of natural human tendencies to adapt our emotional responses to circumstances around us, and we can talk a little bit more about that. But the Epictetan strategy, Epictetus was one of the Stoics. So any of your listeners who have heard of Marcus Aurelius or Cicero or listened to the Daily Stoic podcast have encountered this. Epictetus's view is that you separate facts in the world from your evaluations of those facts. And he gives you a lot of tactics and strategies for doing so. And a lot of them look an awful lot like Buddhism and meditation and the Serenity Prayer. So let me answer that on the Epictetus part, pause and see whether you would also like me to talk about Plato and parts of the soul and your tendency to check email that you told yourself you didn't.
I want you to do all of those things, but I'm going to have to take a break pretty quickly here. So maybe we'll hold on that for a second. And I do feel as though going into this, I had read less Epictetus than I certainly should have. And I do think there is something so profoundly and wonderfully Buddhist about the stuff that he says. And I was reading today about this thing that happened to this actor. It was in the New Yorker. It was the talk of the town. He's this guy who plays villains. And he woke up one day and there was some problem with his email. And it sent him to a site that showed that all of his money had been taken away from him. It had just been looted out of his bank accounts and stuff. And he eventually figured out that it wasn't his bank account. They just looked like that, and somebody was just doing that to terrify him. But he had this moment of thinking that he had lost everything that he had, all the money, he's 61 years old, everything he'd ever saved for was gone. And right around that same time, I was reading this quote from Epictetus: "I have lost nothing that belongs to me. It was not something of mine that was torn from me, but something that was not in my power that has left me." What a great way of thinking about that. You've got about 30 seconds before. I have to be really strict, unusually strict today about breaks and stuff. But if you want to quickly respond to that, Tamar.
Response is just to say Epictetus's handbook was written for public consumption. It is literally the first self-help book. Its title, Enchiridion, basically means ready to hand. It's supposed to be like a sword that you can pull out of your belt. It is available open source in multiple translations on the internet. The entire book is about 50 paragraphs long. You literally could fit it on a deck of cards. And if you do nothing else for your listeners, letting them know that this is a book that is unbelievably easy to read and deep in its suggestions. Plato coming after the break.
All right. Perfectly done. We're going to have a little break here. We're going to ask you to support this radio station. There's a lot of philosophical basis for doing that. So listen to these people. It's going to be a very short break. We made it shorter than usual because we don't want to waste a lot of time or take time away from Tamar. I just do.
Still looks good, and you've got time to rectify all the things that you should. Do what you want to do, and go where you're going to. Think for yourself, 'cause
Yes, the Beatles were also students of Tamar Gendler. I mean, listen to those words. Although your mind's opaque, try thinking more, if just for your own sake. The future still looks good, and you've got time to rectify all the things that you should. Obviously, someone who has studied Plato, Epictetus, and Aristotle. So Tamar Gendler is here with us, a professor of philosophy, psychology, and cognitive science, and the dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Yale University, teaching a new course about some of the values to be found in these ancient philosophical sources for people living in a complex digital age. So first of all, welcome back from the break.
Thanks so much.
So rather than dwell on me and my email problems, let's dwell on somebody else's problems. And let's dwell a little bit on the problems that your students face. And I think this generation of people are uniquely challenged technologically in relation to their own sense of their own happiness and self-worth. And they are very, very comfortable, very familiar with an acronym FOMO, fear of missing out. And they spend a lot of time looking at social media in which other people are having more fun than they are having, which will turn into other people having beautiful children that they don't have yet, or great jobs or vacations or whatever. The ability to have some kind of stillness in which to think about your own state of being, I think is more encroached upon than ever before. So maybe say a little bit about how that works in your course, how maybe some of these people 2,500 years ago who didn't have TikTok and Instagram, how they might help modern people sort out their lives.
Good. And let me say, they didn't have TikTok and Instagram, but they had social pressures. They had the desire to feel important to those around them. They had rules and regulations that were explicit and rules and regulations that were tacit. And they were navigating a social world with limited opportunity due to the form in which they were born, in the same way that human beings always are. So what I would say is the digital world has speeded things up. It has changed things in degree, but it has not changed things in their fundamental form. And the way in which you can see that that's true is I actually do want to go back to your email story, which is the story of giving in to temptation.
Right. So just to remind people who might be joining us.
I'll tell the story in a second, right? Yeah. So Colin tells the story that he puts emails that he doesn't want to read into a file that's called do not read. And then every evening he goes and reads his do not read file. And that is very much an issue that my students face. They face it with social media. They do things like they turn off their phones, they put it across the room, and then they walk across the room, pick up their phones, and turn it right back on. They have a reflective awareness of what it is that would be the best thing to do, given facts about their psychology, and they're nonetheless pulled in a different direction by instincts and tendencies that in some sense are overlearned habits. Okay, what does all this have to do with Plato? So the story that you told of putting your email into a do not read box and then going and reading it is literally structurally identical to a story that Plato tells in the opening of the second chapter of the Republic. So there's a guy walking back to the city. The city has walls around it. And there's basically like a disgusting object in front of the walls. Imagine it's like a car crash where you're tempted to rubberneck. And the guy says to himself in Plato's description, oh, don't look at that. That's disgusting. That would be just indulging your lower self. Keep walking, keep walking. And he's tempted and tempted and tempted. And finally, says Plato, he turns towards the object and holds his eyes open and says, take your fill of the hideous sight. That is, he struggles internally with a set of tendencies. And the opacity that we have with regard to ourselves that you adverted to in the Beatles song is actually because we are composed of lots of different drives and tendencies. That is, we have emotions, and we have the desire to be approved by our friends, and we are hungry, and we find ourselves sexually aroused, or we have old habits that we don't know how to break, or food looks really tempting. And the common theme of the three books that we read in this course is how to tame those instincts, how to get them in a form where to some extent we can have control over our instincts. And you ask for specific examples. Let me give you a framework, which is there are four kinds of strategies which our authors give us, which I call habituate, that is, develop a habit; situate, that is, put yourself in circumstances where it's easy to do what you want; attach, that is, surround yourself by people who will support you; and detach, that is, develop the capacity for quiet stillness. And developing the capacity for quiet stillness is a form of habituation. So habituate, situate, attach, detach. That's going to solve your email and my students' FOMO.
So another thing that you deal with that I find fascinating and very real are things that drive us, rule us, alter our thoughts and actions that we really haven't necessarily thought out. There are automatic reactions based on behaviors and things, but they're totally irrational. You've got a bunch of them. I'll give you mine. All right, which is
Go for it.
I can't drink coffee out of a black mug or even a dark brown mug or anything like that. It just upsets me. It frightens me. I think because I think there's a kraken or something, that I won't be able to see because the mug is dark and then the coffee's dark, and I can't do it. Now that doesn't really make any sense any more than it makes any sense to be afraid of walking across a glass skywalk, which is I know is one that comes up in your class. Talk about these things and this wonderful word you have for them.
Good. So the term that I have is alief, which is sort of like belief, except it's automatic and associative. So your alief is your automatic associative response. And Colin, as usual, you have a capacity to rediscover well-known scientific experiments in your own life. So there's a psychologist named Paul Rosen who does a series of studies where he takes somebody into his lab and they take a glass of water, and the subject in the lab comes and mixes sugar in with the water, stirs it around, takes a sip, enjoys it. And then they put a label, the person in the lab puts a label that says poison do not drink on the glass. And then nobody's willing to drink from the glass. And he has a second study where a person comes into the lab and takes a Tootsie Roll, and the person shapes the Tootsie Roll into the shape of dog feces and is suddenly unwilling to eat it. Okay, these are examples of wildly irrational behavior. If you're willing to take a sip out of this glass before it has the label on it, nothing has happened in the world to make that glass poison once you've stuck the sticker on it. So my view is that a lot of the reactions that we have to the world are automatic associative responses. And in many ways, that's a good thing. We are not fast enough in our rational thought to deal with the world. Most things that we do most of the time have to be things that we've learned by habit or evolution. You can't catch a ball by thinking, where is the ball going to come? You can't play the piano by thinking which note comes next. So too with evolution. It would be a really bad idea if you had to figure out by walking onto a transparent surface that those usually don't support you. So we have a whole bunch of automatic overlearned instincts. And I would argue that what's sometimes called implicit bias or aversive racism or aversive sexism are actually versions of aliefs. They are associative responses that we have despite our better judgment. And if you start thinking about that, we have them all the time. You go to a movie, somebody on the screen points a gun towards the room and you duck. Not because you believe that the bullet's going to come out of the screen, but because you have an automatic associative response to a situation where a gun is pointed towards you. So another way to think about what each of our authors is doing is habituate, situate, attach, detach are tools for getting our aliefs to line up with our beliefs. That is, for getting our automatic associations to line up with our reflective responses, or to slightly temper them in such a way that we go through with what our belief tells us to do rather than what our alief tells us to do in situations where we want to. And I will give you an example of that momentarily if I still have time.
I'll tell you what, give us a quick example, then we'll do another break. And there's a whole other segment of this that I want to make sure we get to.
So this is just a wild, hilarious example. So one of the fantastic things about the 8 students in my course is that one of the students was what we call an Eli Whitney student. He was a student who age-wise is in his 50s. He didn't attend college earlier because he was serving the U.S. as a member of the U.S. military. And he is actually the person who trains members of the military in skydiving. And the activity that he decided to have my class engage in, so as to study the power of attachment and of alief and belief, was that he took my whole class skydiving. And beforehand, they read all sorts of articles about the ways in which skydiving is actually no more dangerous than any other kind of sport. And they also read a lot of articles about the ways in which surrounding yourself by a social norm can make it easier to behave in a way that you wouldn't otherwise behave. And then all my students went up into an airplane and put GoPros in front of their eyes and jumped out of the airplane. And every single one of them, even though they had read all these articles about how safe it was, found the experience absolutely terrifying. And every single one of them was able to do it because they had surrounded themselves by a group of peers. And that example, where they jumped out of the airplane, actually served as the basis for a reflective exercise that the students did as they thought through a set of examples in Plato and Aristotle and Epictetus.
Wow. I had one of those students 2 semesters ago, but he wasn't a skydiving. We didn't have to go skydiving. But there's a wonderful little ending to this story, which is that tomorrow, it's a big surprise, that same student is going to take Lily Tyson, our senior producer, skydiving. It's a little treat we're delivering for.
That is fantastic.
Yeah, just
he is a great skydiving instructor and recommended to all. Thank you so much. And now we're doing another break.
This is like 60 seconds. We'll be back very, very fast. So here we go. We'll take one of these breaks and then tomorrow we'll be right back.
I'm
perfectly calm, indifferent to tensions and shocks. Unruffled and ready, my nerves are as steady as rocks. I'm calm, controlled, so cool that I'm cold, aloofer than any giraffe. When something's the matter, where others would shatter,
All episodes of The Colin McEnroe Show are available 24/7 on any podcast app. If there's a place for reviews and ratings, give us lots of stars and be sure to mention the high thread count in our sheets and pillowcases, as well as the complimentary breakfast buffet. Have a question or comment? Email us at colinshow@ctpublic.org. Now, back to the show.
We are back. Our technical producer today is Kat Pastor, which is the way we like things to be. Lily Tyson is the senior producer of The Colin McEnroe Show. And prior to her skydiving experience tomorrow, she is the producer of this particular episode as well. Tamar Gendler is with us today, professor of philosophy, psychology, and cognitive science, and the dean of faculty of arts and sciences at Yale University. So one of the things that you're doing in this course, Tamar, I think, is sort of showing ways and maybe even new forms for the consumption of philosophical ideas. And we've seen this a little bit on television recently, and you've seen it in your class. I'm going to give two different examples. The first one is from television. This is from The Good Place. You're going to hear Chidi. If you watch this, you know Chidi is the person who actually has background as an academic philosopher. He's trying to explain something to the, as usual, kind of uncomprehending Eleanor. This is A1 Cat.
Aristotle was Plato's student, and Aristotle believes that your character is voluntary because it's just the result of your actions which are under your control. For example, right now, you have made the insane choice to ignore the person who is literally trying to save you from eternal damnation.
No, yeah, I'm listening. Are we sure we should be paying attention to these guys? It's like, who died and left Aristotle in charge of ethics?
Plato.
All right. So, and by the way, I think we're recovering Tamar's Zoom connection. So this is good that I have something else to do. So in her class, one of the things, and I have to say that if you are teaching college students, one of the things that you have to deal with is the fact that TikTok is just a bigger influence on their lives than you can possibly imagine. So kind of in the style of Billy on the Street, the Billy Eichner thing, one of her students decided to go out there and do TikTok videos in the form of Plato on the street. We'll hear a little bit of that. This is B1.
There's a charioteer. That's the rational part of the soul. And he is in charge of the two horses. One is the spirited horse and one is the appetitive horse.
Are you a horse girl?
Are you?
I'm not a girl.
Are you a horse?
He's a whore. Right now, I might be.
Right. Do you feel more aligned with like the appetitive or the spirited horse?
Can we speak English, please?
Sure. That you can train your charioteer to rein in the appetitive and spirited parts of your soul. Do you guys think that that's something you'd be able to do?
I mean, I could follow like the first three commandments.
All right. Actually, we might have even cut off her great comeback. She says, wrong tradition. But so we are right now reestablishing a Zoom connection, I think, with Tamar Gendler. So let me just say a little bit more about what we've been talking about today. Tamar Gendler is a professor of philosophy, psychology, and cognitive science, and the dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Yale University. And she is introducing a course. She's done it with a group of 8 students last spring, but she's going to introduce a course to a much wider audience that will try to familiarize an even broader public with these things. And I do feel as though we're living in an age where this stuff is more and more important and maybe less accessible to a lot of people. And one of the things that I was shocked by when I was at one point when I was teaching last spring, and this is a political science course, but we talk about political journalism and we talk about different forms of political journalism. One of the things that I quizzed them about a little bit was their use of TikTok. And they, after a while, got these kind of hollow expressions on their faces and began to describe their experiences on TikTok. And one of them discussed maybe having been on TikTok for 10 hours a day during the shutdown of the pandemic. So think about the influence something like that has on a person. All right. I think we've got Tamar Gendler back by phone. Hi. Are you there?
Hello. I am here. And in fact, I overheard you talking about TikTok and would be delighted to speak to you about the role that it played in public Plato ancient philosophy for the digital age.
Right. Well, I should tell you, maybe you didn't hear this. We actually played a little clip from Plato on the Street, which one of your students was doing. So, yeah, one of the things the philosophers did in Greece 2,500 years ago is use whatever forms were available. There are so many other different forms available now. So say something about that.
Good. So it sounds like you already mentioned that one of the really striking things is that when we look back at philosophers, we think they're using old-fashioned techniques. But in fact, they are always at the cutting edge of the technology of their time. So Socrates is out there literally in the part of the city where the cool kids are hanging out, having conversations with them. It's as if he's doing the equivalent of going clubbing. The early modern philosophers are at the cutting edge of science. They're trying to figure out the implications of Newtonian physics and calculus for philosophy. And in the same way, I think contemporary philosophers should be thinking about contemporary technology. So there are ways in which it's quite similar to what it was. We're still human beings with a very small part of ourselves that's rational and a very big part of ourselves that's non-human animal. That is always going to be the case. But that evolved, complicated creature suddenly finds itself in a world where social interaction isn't just local, it's global, and where we have come to understand enough about human beings to manipulate them effectively. Now, in some sense, this was always true. Plato is afraid of the power of theater because he thinks it manipulates us into having emotions that we don't really have. And Aristotle is actually really interested in the power of drama to allow us to experience what he calls catharsis. So in some sense, philosophers have been worried about the way in which art hacks the system. But we have become better and better hackers. Junk food hacks the system that tells you eat things that are fatty and sweet because they'll be nutritious. And TikTok hacks the system that says engage in things that give you a certain kind of dopamine response.
True.
And so the question is, what do we do? What do we do? And the answer, once again, is to recognize that these are all facts about circumstance, that they absolutely differ in degree from what our ancestors faced. They do not differ in kind, and that the four strategies, habituate, situate, attach, detach, are what help creatures built like us solve problems.
Right. No way would Plato have done TikTok. Plato didn't he was worried about poetry and flutes. He didn't like those flutes with reeds in them. So, I mean.
Absolutely. No, Plato would not have been, Plato, he was, at least in his explicit statements, really hostile to new technology. But he was hostile to new technology for a very simple reason, which is he recognized how powerful it was. You don't ban something you don't care about. Isn't it cool to think theater could have been something important enough that you would devote a chapter of your book to getting rid of it?
Well, that's one way of looking at it. Okay, so we only got 3 minutes left. This is horrible. I've got 30 minutes of questions easy for you. So in the 3 minutes, I think this might be kind of fun. Okay, let's say Plato's alive today. I'm thinking he might be a podcaster. What do you think he'd be doing?
Absolutely. I think he would have Socrates as the person, right? So Plato would be Plato would be the producer of a podcast. And his podcast person, his Colin McEnroe, would be Socrates. So you are basically the Socrates of Connecticut Public Radio.
And someone's bringing me a very nice cup of tea right now. So it's all coming true. And it looks delicious, too. And it doesn't even have a label on the front of it that says...
I hope it's in a light-colored mug.
There's no label that says poison on it, so I know that I'm safe. Okay, so there's Plato. So Aristotle, what do you think? I think Aristotle's maybe working on some kind of tech startup, that might improve communication somehow. Something that's better than X or Twitter or so. What do you think Aristotle's doing if he's around right now?
So Aristotle's actually an incredible collector. So some of you may know Aristotle was Plato's student. Plato was Socrates' student. And what Aristotle contributed to the Western intellectual tradition is he collected stuff, right? He collected teeth and tried to figure out how animal mouths worked. And he collected constitutions from every city and state. So I actually think Aristotle would be director of the Smithsonian. But in addition, he would be building the largest digital repository of information. So Aristotle would run the Smithsonian and the Wikipedia.
That is brilliant. I wholeheartedly agree. Not that that really matters that much. But and so Epictetus, I'm thinking, goes to Burning Man once, hates it. But he sets up something in Sedona where he's mostly alone, but you can come maybe to spend some time with him, do a retreat, a very small retreat, not too many people. I don't know. You got about 60 seconds. What are you going to do with Epictetus?
So I would say definitely he doesn't go back to Burning Man. He doesn't want to get caught in the rain because he knows the weather is not up to him, so he's not going to go there. I think Epictetus cared about hitting a larger group in the world than something elite like Sedona would let him do. I actually think that Epictetus might become a TikTok artist. He literally wanted to write his words in a way that reached the maximum number of people. He was trying to give you something that's just always with you. I think actually, here's a better bet. Epictetus would issue a line of jewelry with slogans on it that you would collect and wear around your wrist. That's what he would do, and he would have a line of tattoos with really cool themes that you could get all over your body. That is what Epictetus would do.
You are fast on your feet, Tamar Gendler. That was good. We didn't give you any warning when I was going to throw this at you. All right. Professor of Philosophy, Psychology, Cognitive Science, and the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Yale University. We will let you know when this exciting new course becomes available to a wider audience.